We live in a world of constant communication. Text messages, social media, emails, and of course face-to-face conversations. But how often do we really think about the nature of our speech, our communication with other people? The Buddha taught that speech has the power to create harmony, peace, or to sow discord among us. So it's not only a critical part of the Eightfold Path of Buddhist practice, but it's a critical part of our lives and of making the world a better place. In this video, we'll explore what the Buddha had to say about effective and skillful communication, and how we can apply his teachings to our lives in the modern world today. But let's begin at the beginning. Right speech is the third of the steps along the Eightfold Path. I've done a number of videos on right speech, and I'll leave links to those down below in the notes if you want a refresher on them. But basically, right speech is one of three different aspects of what's known as sila, or the ethical part of the path, including right action and right livelihood. And right speech is generally defined as avoiding four kinds of talk. In particular, avoiding lying, avoiding divisive speech, speech that divides one person from another, avoiding harsh speech, and avoiding what's known as either idle chatter or gossip, that is to say, sort of meaningless or useless speech. Now, why does speech matter? Because speech has real consequences. All communication that we do has real consequences. What we say can influence the people around us, our relationships, and indeed our communities at large. So speech communication matters. As the Buddha says in the Dhammapada, better than 1,000 meaningless sayings is a single meaningful saying, hearing which brings you peace. Speech and communication also matter because how we speak, how we communicate with others, is generally a reflection of how we are thinking. So right speech and skillful communication depends upon mindful self-awareness of the way that we're thinking about the world. Second, I want to turn to some criteria for well-spoken speech. In another sutta in the Pali tradition, the Buddha discusses 5 criteria for when something is well-spoken. Now there's some overlap here with the idea of right speech, but there's some that's different, and I think it deserves separate treatment, because this is I think a fuller and a somewhat deeper understanding of how and why really communication can be beneficial. As the Buddha says, mendicants, speech that has 5 factors is well spoken, not poorly spoken. It's blameless and is not criticized by sensible people. What 5? It is speech that is timely, true, gentle, beneficial, and kind. Now these 5 criteria can, I think, help us to navigate through a sea of difficult conversations with other people. So to begin with, the Buddha talks about speech that's timely. Because many times, when we are very caught up in the moment with anger or whatever it might be, some very strong emotion, we communicate, we speak in a way that is off the cuff, that is at the wrong time. We speak immediately and forcefully in a way to sort of make a splash, and that attitude, that tendency we have to speak immediately without thinking, is one that tends to harm rather than benefiting. Second, we should engage in true speech. This is clear from the idea of right speech that we've already discussed, but not only should we avoid lying, of course, but we should also avoid needless exaggeration or extreme exaggeration. We should try to be as accurate as we can when we communicate with other people. Also, speech, he says, should be gentle. This, I think, is the flip side of speech that's harsh. That is, we want to make our speech as tender as possible, given the circumstances. Now, there's a bit of a caveat here, which I'll get to in a moment. Also, speech should be beneficial. That is, we should intend our speech to be helpful to others, not harmful to others. And this goes hand in hand with the last criterion, which is that our speech should be kind. That is, We should understand speech to be made, intended with a mind of what's known as loving kindness, or metta. And this, having this kind of mind state, I think gets us about 80 or 90% the way there to skillful speech. That is, if we can try to ensure that we communicate with a mind of kindness, where kindness is behind what we are getting across to others, we're most likely to be engaging in the other 4 characteristics here of skillful speech. Now, to return to the topic of gentleness here, it's important to keep in mind that in a different sutta, the Buddha does talk about the fact that sometimes we are obligated to say things that are uncomfortable or that will be disliked by other people. The Buddha in that sutta analogizes this to a father who has to pull a stick or a stone from his child's mouth, even the Buddha says if it draws blood, because of course he's trying to save the child's life. And indeed, in many different suttas, the Buddha does speak in a very stern manner to certain monastics who he believes have gone off the rails for one reason or another. However, such speech has to fulfill the other criteria we've just discussed. It has to be timely, has to be true, has to be kind, has to be beneficial. Sometimes the only way to be truly kind and beneficial is to speak difficult truths, but we have to be careful with this. We have to ask ourselves when we're engaging in these kinds of discussions, are we really speaking at the appropriate time? Are we really saying something that's true? Are we really saying something that's going to be beneficial? And are we really speaking it or communicating it with a mind of kindness rather than a mind of anger? Third, I think it's important to get more of a picture of what the Buddha really meant with communication by looking at some examples of difficult communication in the suttas. Perhaps the most famous of these examples occurs in the simile of the saw. In that sutta, the Buddha talks about the fact that we should, even if we're being assaulted to the point of death by other people, we should always maintain a mind of kindness and not fall into a mind of anger or hatred. And if this goes for physical pain and suffering, then it must go doubly, the Buddha says basically, if all that's at issue are words, if we're only being assaulted or harassed verbally. We should always maintain this mind of loving kindness. And another famous example in the suttas involves a Brahmin named Bharadvaja who comes at the Buddha with some very rude kinds of insults. Basically, Bharadvaja came to the Buddha in a state of deep anger or fury, we might say. And the sutta is wonderful in showing how the Buddha is able to turn this kind of anger in a different direction by asking of very skillful questions. The sutta says, "Angry and displeased, Bharadvaja went to the Buddha and abused and insulted him with rude, harsh words. When he had spoken, the Buddha said to him, 'What do you think, Brahmin? Do friends and colleagues, relatives and kin and guests still come to visit you?' 'Sometimes they do, Mr. Gautama.' 'Do you then serve them with fresh and cooked foods and savories?' 'Sometimes I do.' 'But if they don't accept it, Brahmin, who does it belong to?' 'In that case, it still belongs to me.' 'In the same way, Brahmin, when you abuse, harass, and attack us, who do not abuse and harass and attack, we don't accept it. It still belongs to you, Brahmin. It still belongs to you.' So here the Buddha responds delightfully with a kind of surprise. After being insulted, he asks the Brahmin a question completely out of left field. Do friends, people come to visit you, to have dinner with you? It's a completely unexpected question. It defuses the situation. Eventually, Bharadvaja joins the Sangha and becomes enlightened. This illustrates the way that the Buddha could be mindful under duress, under this kind of harsh questioning or harsh speech, and is able to mindfully turn the conversation. Again, this displays how communication can both be used to make people more angry by indulging in harsh speech and berating others, or it can be used skillfully to defuse a difficult situation. Fourth, let's turn to right communication or right speech in the modern world. The world that we live in now of constant communication, of social media, is one that tends to amplify divisive, harsh, and difficult kinds of speech between people. The algorithms behind social media often thrive or boost communication that's divisive or negative, that inflames our passions. And when we're able to hide behind the anonymity of a meaningless username online, we tend to engage in speech that is much nastier than speech that we would engage in, or communication we would engage in, if we were face-to-face, or it were our real name that were being used to demonstrate who we really are in the conversation. So if you do engage in online conversations, try not to be that sort of person. Social media can also create echo chambers that tend to amplify this kind of negativity. So I would urge you, when online, to take a time out before responding if you feel that the conversation is getting difficult or heated. Ask yourself, is what I'm about to write here true? Is it helpful? Is it timely? Can I do it with a mind of kindness? Or is what I'm writing being written out of pure anger? Right? And if we are writing out of pure anger, perhaps we can step back. Again, take a time out. Or refrain from responding at all. And I think it goes without saying, the great cliche of online discourse, don't feed trolls. Trolls are people who thrive on this kind of negative interaction. And when it comes to gossip, particularly online gossip, ask whether what you're going to share is really useful, is really helpful to anybody. Or is it simply a bit of humor at somebody's expense? And if the latter, then perhaps see or consider if there's some way to change the conversation into a more useful or beneficial direction. We should also always, when it comes to communication, try to practice charitable listening, open listening. That is to say, not beginning a conversation or even continuing one assuming that the other person is obviously wrong. Try to find whatever common ground there is, listen with an open mind and open heart, and be willing to learn something, whatever you might be able to, from a conversation. That is to say, don't focus on winning so much as on listening. And if you're not able to do that in a particular conversation with a particular person, for whatever reason, it may be best simply not to engage at all. In conclusion, the Buddha taught that speech is extremely powerful, and that practicing right speech is a key part of Buddhist practice, a key part of the Eightfold Path itself. Indeed, it might be one of the hardest parts of Buddhist practice for many of us lay people living ordinary lives. Because speech can create discord among us, it can create anger and enmity, or it can create harmony and friendships and goodwill among us. It all depends on whether we're able to engage in such communication with kindness, where we're trying to make beneficial communication, where we're trying to speak truthfully at the right time, in the right way, gently. And in today's world of pretty much 24/7 communication with the world, right speech and right communication, therefore, is more important than ever. Again, it can be used to create harmony or discord depending on how we engage in it. So I would ask you, how do you engage in right speech? How could you make your speech better, make your communication more skillful over the next week or so? What sorts of tricks or methods have you found useful to you when you're speaking or communicating online with other people? If you want to see a video I've done in the past about the relationship between Buddhist right speech and the idea, the concept of free speech in the West, in America, and other places, take a look at this video I did a while back. It should be at least of some interest to you, if you haven't seen it or would like to see it again. Thanks so much, and if you're getting something out of these videos of mine, consider taking a look at my Patreon page, which is linked up here on the screen or down below in the notes, and see if you want to help support the channel and the work that I'm doing here. Thanks so much, and we'll catch you on the next video, and meanwhile, all of you, be well.